Welcome to the Feed Your Family Tonight podcast. Do you dread hearing the question, what's for dinner? Whether you spend your days keeping up with toddlers, running kids to after-school activities, or juggling a career and family, getting dinner on the table can be a struggle for us all. I'm Mariefiebach, a business owner, wife, and mom of 4. I'm on a mission to build stronger families one dinner at a time, and I'm here with tips, tricks, and inspiration you need to feed your family tonight. Hello, friends. Welcome to the Feed Your Family Tonight podcast, episode 143. I'm your host, Mariefiebach, and today we are going to talk about salt. Now, if you have been a long-time listener, way back in 2019 in episode 13, I did a deep dive into salt, and I talked about all of the different kinds of salt and how they are harvested and processed and some of the best applications for those different kinds of salt. It's a really fun episode with lots of really great information. Today's episode, we're kind of going to take in a little bit different direction. I am going to talk about some more of the practical ways to use salt so that your food tastes better. I always want to preface, I am not a medical professional. If you have someone that is a medical professional that has told you that you need to use a certain type of salt or you need to reduce the amount of salt, please listen to them. I am here to help home cooks get dinner on the table, and part of that is making dinner taste delicious so your family will actually eat the food that you make, and that's kind of what we're going to focus on today. Salt is a huge part of making food taste good. We all know that people are getting a lot of sodium, especially from processed foods. But if you are like me and you are actually cooking a lot at home and not really relying on processed foods very much, then worrying about the amount of salt that you put into your food may not be as necessary. As a matter of fact, you need to think about adding enough salt to your food so that it tastes good. We do need sodium in our bodies. It's something that is important. And again, if you want your food to taste good, you need to use salt liberally and at the right time. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Chefs know their salt. When you eat food in a restaurant, part of the reason that it tastes really good is that restaurant cooks or chefs are much more liberal with salt and fat than we are in our own homes. And we don't want to eat restaurant food every day in our homes, but adding a little bit more salt at the right time and using it properly can take food from something that is okay to something that is absolutely delicious. In my home, I probably have at least a dozen different salts floating around. I know I really like salt, but there are 2 salts that I have to have in my house at all times. If I don't have these 2 salts in my house, then we're going to have trouble. The first one is table salt. Did that surprise you that I actually said table salt? There's a very specific reason why I keep table salt in my house, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the second one is Celtic sea salt. Celtic sea salt is actually a brand of salt that is harvested from the pools in France. I know it sounds all fancy-dancy, and it might be a little bit fancy-dancy, but it is an absolutely delicious salt that has a lot of trace minerals. And because it has all those trace minerals, it tastes saltier without having as much sodium, if that's the best way I can describe it. There's something, a little bit of the Celtic sea salt can really satisfy that salty taste with using actually physically less salt. I buy my Celtic sea salt in a 5-pound bag from Amazon. I will link to that in the show notes if you think that you're going to get on the bandwagon with me. I'll also link in the show notes to a package that has 2 1-pound bags, so it's not quite the commitment of a 5-pound bag of salt. But using Celtic sea salt really does make a difference in your cooking. And all of my recipes, with the exception of my baking recipes on my website, are actually tested and written with Celtic sea salt. Now, baking is why I need to have some table salt around, because The Celtic sea salt that I use has large grains of salt, and that does not work really, really well with baking. Baking is very much a science. It is very much a precision. And table salt has nice, fine grains that are always the same by weight and by volume measurement. So a teaspoon of table salt is always going to be a teaspoon of table salt, and it's going to weigh the same amount. When you are baking, you need that precision, but you also need the fine grains that the table salt provides. You want that salt to be able to dissolve in a minimal amount of liquid. And when you're making something like a muffin or a cake or a cookie, there really isn't a lot of liquid there. And so you want that salt to be able to dissolve, and you need table salt for that. Table salt comes in two main forms. One of them is iodized. The other one is uniodized. I prefer the uniodized salt, but if you want to know the absolute truth, my husband has this thing where he grew up with the flavor of iodized salt, and he can tell the difference. And so I keep iodized salt, and when I bake, that's what I usually use, even though it isn't my preference. So those are the two salts that I have in my house. I want us to dig into a little bit about how to use salt. Earlier this year, I did a recipe on Cake TV for blanched and roasted vegetables. I probably should have come up with like a snazzy title like vegetables that are to die for or something, because they really are different. After I posted this recipe, a friend of mine sent me a text, and I want to read you a little bit about what she said. She said, "Life-changing. Our broccoli and cauliflower didn't even make it to the table. It was devoured straight from the pan." Friends, that is the magic of salt. When you use this technique of blanching veggies before you roast them, you take water and you add a lot of salt. You add veggies to a pan of boiling salted water, and you just let them cook in the water for 1 or 2 minutes. And in those 1 or 2 minutes, some magic happens. Because the veggies are in a salty water bath, the salt actually has a chance to kind of penetrate deep into the veggies rather than just on the surface. True blanching, you would take them out and you would put them in an ice bath to stop the cooking. But what I do in this recipe is I just put them straight onto an oiled pan and roast them in the oven. But that salting and blanching step first causes that salt to penetrate deep into the veggies, and it makes them so delicious. I will even blanch veggies and chill them and put them in the refrigerator and then just eat them cold. My favorite vegetable to do that with is asparagus. Oh my goodness. Blanched asparagus that has been in that salty water for just 1 or 2 minutes still has that kind of crunch, but it has that salty, savory flavor. And I could eat like half a pound of blanched asparagus just straight out of the refrigerator. May actually have done that on more than one occasion. It is so delicious. But the key is that you are using that salted water so that the salt has a chance through osmosis to penetrate deep into the vegetables. Timing of salt is really important. If you had just roasted those veggies and sprinkled the salt on top, the salt would not have a chance to penetrate deep into the veggies, and you'll get the salt on the outside, but you don't get that flavor all the way through the veggies. And that is how the timing of salt can be really important. When you are doing blanched veggies or things like cooking pasta in salted water, it's really hard to have too much salt. It's possible. You can have too much salt, but in most cases, it's almost impossible to have too much salt. So go ahead and put in a good tablespoon or 2 of salt into your salty water that you're cooking your veggies, or your salty water that you are cooking your pasta. Most of that salt is going to get washed down the drain, but the amount of salt will help more of the salt get into the food that's cooking and will make the food taste delicious. My father actually has had to go low sodium for some health reasons, and my mother cooks her pasta without salt in the water, and the difference between that pasta and the pasta that I cook at home is night and day. Now, good, there's really good reasons why my mother's not salting, and no problem with that. But if you want your food to taste extra delicious, use a heavy hand with the salt. When you are making things like sauces, you need to be a little bit more careful with your salt, especially if your sauce is having some type of prepared product in it. So if you have some canned tomatoes in your sauce, or you have some chicken broth in your sauce, homemade chicken broth, you kind of have a little bit better control over how much sodium is in there. But if you're using a canned or boxed chicken broth from the grocery store, I always recommend buying low sodium chicken broth, because as it reduces, the sodium is going to concentrate, and somehow the sodium in the chicken broth, it doesn't add the flavor that adding salt on your own does, and you can quickly end up with a sauce that is too salty. Back in episode 93, I had Kendra Adachi, the lazy genius, on the podcast, and she is as much of a salt evangelist as I am, and she will tell her listeners to salt the food until it sings. Not a super highly technical term. I don't really have a highly technical term for how much you need to salt the food, but for me, I feel like you need to salt it until you're like, wow, that tastes amazing. If you are making a sauce of some sort and you taste and you're like, that's good, add a little more salt. Be like, oh, that's really good. And then add just a little bit more salt and you're like, okay, wow, that tastes amazing. And when you're adding salt, you want to add in small increments and taste it as you go, because undoing too much salt is a little bit more challenging. Now, if you go back to listen to episode 13, I do have some tips in that episode about what to do if you have put too much salt in your food. There are some scientific things that you can do to help if you've put too much salt in your food. So if you're interested in that, go listen to episode 13. Add it in small little increments and taste as you go. And when you think that it's almost there, add just a little bit more. And when it goes wow, or as Kendra Adachi would say, when it sings, then you know that you have enough salt. The next thing I kind of want to talk about is salting meat. When you are salting meat, you basically have two choices. You can salt the meat really early and give the salt time, or you can salt it immediately before cooking. Most meats benefit from the magic equation of salt and time. It really is best if you can salt your meat early. What happens when you salt your meat early is that the salt sits on the surface of the meat, and what it does is it actually starts to draw the moisture out of the meat. And then as it sits there over time, osmosis, if you go back to 7th grade science class, osmosis, the salt will actually start drawing the moisture back into the meat, and you're going to get a meat that has better flavor, and it usually has a higher moisture content, and it is going to be much more delicious. Now, when you are salting this meat over time, you want to do it in the refrigerator, and you want to, if possible, have the meat open to the air of the refrigerator rather than wrapped in plastic wrap or sealed in a container. And that is because the air of the refrigerator will actually dehydrate the surface of the meat. And in most meats, you want to get a nice sear or a nice brown crust on the outside of whatever meat you are cooking. And water is the enemy of a nice sear. And so you want to give the meat a chance to actually slightly dehydrate on the surface, and you're going to end up with meat that browns easier, and that is also going to give it more flavor. When you are salting meats, you probably want to know how much salt to use. The rule of thumb is to use 1 teaspoon of coarse salt or kosher salt per pound. If you're using table salt, it's down to about 3/4 of a teaspoon per pound, but I like coarse salt or kosher salt because the flakes are larger and they cover the surface area a little bit better. It works better for salting meats. Rule of thumb is about 1 teaspoon per pound of meat.
When talking about chicken specifically, you want to know
there are all sorts of different kinds of chicken that you can buy. Some of them are air chilled, some of them are organic, some of them are free range, some of them are the least expensive chicken. The one thing that I look for with chicken in the grocery store is that I look to see if the chicken package says broth solution added. If the package says broth solution added, there is salt in that chicken. And when you go to salt it, you are going to want to use less salt. My roast chicken recipe, which I will link to in the show notes, I have you salt the chickens the night before, and you put them into the refrigerator, open air, on a roasting pan or a baking sheet, and let the salt work its magic over time, and the air will dehydrate the surface, and you end up with these roast chickens that have juicy meat and salty, crisp skin that is absolutely irresistible. I have been known to salt my chickens up to 3 days ahead before cooking. Now, overnight is usually enough, but if you have time and you can let those chickens sit in your refrigerator for a couple of days, I discovered this when I salted my chickens, and then life happened, and for 2 days I didn't get a chance to roast them. If that is you, you are totally not alone. We all have days when that happens, but I learned that if you let that salt sit there for 3 days, it takes the chickens from delicious to, oh my gosh, what is this amazing food that I have made? So salt plus time equals magic when it comes to meat. Same as with beef or pork or any other meat that you are making. You usually want to have salt and thyme. The exception to that rule is when you're using ground meat. Things like ground turkey and ground hamburger, salting ahead of time can kind of affect the texture and sometimes can make them taste a little bit spongy. But you definitely want to be salting them as they are cooking. This past January, I was shooting some video for a special project, and I was at my friend's house, and we were cooking beef in a cast iron skillet on her stove. And I said, okay, well, you need to put some salt on there. And she said, well, I never salt my meat when I'm cooking. And I said, oh my goodness, you've got to salt your meat while you are cooking, because once it is already cooked, that salt is not going to penetrate deep into the fibers of the meat. And you're going to need more salt to make it taste good, and it's not going to penetrate all the way in. So when you are cooking things like ground beef and ground turkey or ground chicken, make sure that you are salting them when you are cooking. I could go on and on about how to cook hamburger, and maybe that's a podcast for another day, because there are definite things that you should be doing to get the most flavor out of your ground meats as you cook them. But you definitely want to salt them as they are cooking, but maybe not salt them before. I hope this has inspired you to use a little bit more salt. Maybe try an unrefined salt like that Celtic sea salt that I'll link in the show notes. It really will make a difference in how your foods taste. It will even make a difference in the texture if you're using salt properly. But do not be afraid of salt. Be sure, especially if you're doing things like sauces, to taste as you go and add just a little bit of it at a time. And when you think your food tastes good, add just a little bit more, and I bet you your food is going to taste great. For now, friends, I am so glad that you joined me today. Be sure to catch up with me in the Feed Your Family Tonight Facebook group. We'll be talking a little bit about salt this week. I would love to hear the kinds of salt that you are using in your house. And if you have any questions about salt, please ask them. I'll do my best to answer them for you. For now, friends, I hope you are doing well. Take care.